There's been a persistent myth since roughly, I would say, the late 1960s to where animation is just for kids. Now, keep in mind, Hanna-Barbera cartoons had ads for cigarettes and all sorts of products that kids wouldn't use. They had laugh tracks. They were just sitcoms that were animated. A lot of them were. And they were shows that just happened to be animated. But the humor wasn't exactly childish, especially Looney Tunes. Go back and watch some of the golden age of Looney Tunes, which would have been roughly from the 1950s to the 1970s. It was certainly not just for kids. Kids could watch it, but there was a lot of innuendo and adult humor. It was far more creative than the way they do innuendo and adult humor today, and far less vulgar, but it was there. These were not programs aimed at kids. These were programs aimed at, if anything, general audiences slash adults. And in America, since roughly the late 1960s onward, with the whole Saturday morning cartoon thing, the idea became, oh, kids are watching these more and more. So when you got to the 80s, they started becoming glorified toy commercials. The animation was very simplistic. They became just blatant toy commercials. He-Man and the Master of the Universe, Transformers, G.I. Joe. You know, there were a whole bunch of series that just were glorified toy commercials. And you saw commercials for the different play sets and all that things. Strawberry Shortcake, which might have been a little later. My Little Pony for sure. But some of these were just blatantly like Hasbro went, hey, we want to make toys. Or Mattel, hey, we want to make toys. So that's what they became. And ever since then, that stigma has stayed for roughly almost 40 years now. It's crazy. But as we've seen with Japan, as we've seen throughout Europe and Korea, you know, we've seen in France in particular, we know that animation is simply a vehicle for telling a story. You know, that's what it is, because you've got dramas, you've got horror, you've got westerns, you've got sci-fi slash space opera, you've got all of these subgenres in just Japanese anime alone. Anime is not considered just for kids. It is for literally everybody. There's categories for everybody, but there's also stuff where anybody can watch, you know? And that stuff's not just dumbed down for kids. That's just stuff anybody can watch. You can argue that early on, at least at points, The Simpsons was a family show, or was geared more towards families. It was certainly edgy, but there were several episodes that as I went back and watched the series, because I wasn't allowed to watch it as a kid, my mom was very much in that whole 90s zeitgeist of there were certain shows you just didn't let your kids watch. And The Simpsons was one of them. So I went back and watched it when I got older, and I realized there's a lot of these episodes that are acceptable for kids. There are going to be jokes that go over their heads, but it wasn't anything terribly offensive, really. And it just depended on which episode, which season, and all of that. But you can argue that the concept of The Simpsons was a family show. I mean, they could merchandise to kids, and they did. They had a whole bunch of Bart Simpson merchandise. They had an arcade game and several video games. So they knew kids were watching, but it was primarily an adult show. And the problem I have is, like, they didn't do the same thing with Family Guy for sure, because by the time Family Guy came along, it was just, oh, that's blatantly for adults. You know, they're pushing the envelope beyond what The Simpsons was willing to do at the time, you know? Simpsons has gotten since a little bit more edgier, I think, in response to something like Family Guy and American Dad. But, you know, in its heyday, The Simpsons was, I think, generally acceptable for young audiences. Again, depending on the episode, there were episodes where they dealt with very adult issues, but they were aware that kids were watching, so they wrote it with more kid-friendly episodes, at least in mind, I would assume. I don't know that for a fact, don't take my word for it, but based on my own observations, it seems like that was the case. Because Fox was smart enough to realize they needed to capitalize on the kid market and the fact that there was this stigma about animation for kids. So they just took advantage and they played into it. But in the 21st century, in 2023, unfortunately, there's still this lingering stigma from the 80s that animation is just for kids to sell toys. There's still people who genuinely believe that. And they won't try anything. Even stuff from Japan. They're like, I hate that anime. Why do adults like this? I'm like, well, you don't, first of all, you don't live in Japan. which is a part of their culture as well. It's part of what they would consider television and movies and all of that. And it's not just kids. But second of all, you haven't done your research. A lot of people who just write that stuff off haven't done their research. I'm not saying you need to love anime as a genre, which it's multiple genres, by the way. I think that's the problem. Anime is very much typecast in the United States as being a genre as opposed to being an art style with multiple genres, which is what it actually is. So when people say, "Oh, I hate anime," it's like, okay, well, what kind of anime do you hate? Is there an anime you like? There might be an anime you like. You just haven't seen the other genres. You know, there's more than just Dragon Ball Z. There's more than just Pokemon. You know, there's a horror, there's westerns, there's Shakespearean dramas, there's all sorts of sci-fi. There's a genre for everybody, and it's exploding in the West because people are realizing this. And the West isn't even trying to keep up with it. They're not even making an effort to animate stuff that's wide in variety and in genre. They're not even attempting it. Even though they are arguably the originators of animation in its purest form and the perfecters of the art. We've just given up and we've said it's either for preschoolers, kids, or adults, but there's no crossover in the 21st century. I don't know why. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me, but that's exactly where it's at, and it's been at that point for so many years. I try to break the stigma by making videos like this, but ultimately it's up to audience members to decide what they think. You know, it's up to people who have these conversations with people who like animation. It's the people who like animation, it's up to them to be honest about it and just say, well, look, at the end of the day, animation is not just for kids and it's not just for adults. It's in between, and everybody has something that they love. You know, you don't have to write this off as, oh, that stupid kiddie crap. You don't have to do that. It's unnecessary. There's a lot of adults who work. And by the way, who creates that stuff for kids? Do you think kids are making that? No, adults are making it. So the art of animation isn't just for kids, it's for everybody. If I was more talented, I'd make cartoons for Orange Cactus Studios. I really would. You know, if I was to launch Orange Cactus Studios into a grander subject aside from just comic strips, I would make cartoons. But animation is tough. Ask anybody who does it. It is one of the most difficult things to do. I think that's another reason why it just doesn't see the amount of wide appeal that it does, is because making it is difficult. So making something for everybody, aside from the actual labor involved, is a difficult task. It's a very difficult task because it's all got to look good. You know, if it doesn't look good, then people take notice of that. You know, back in the day, you know, back with Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera, it was mostly short form stuff, so people didn't have the time to, especially with Looney Tunes, people didn't have the time to pay attention to the animation quality. And people like to go back and point out animation errors and errors in the cells and all of that. But in today's digital day and age, you can make any art style you want, and you can make it as clean as you want, or as messed up as you want, or whatever, you know? But one day I'd like to produce an animated series. I don't know if it'll ever happen. I'm not pursuing it at all as any sort of career. I just like talking about animation, old animation. That's why I do Toonie Talk. Toonie Talk is one of my favorite series I do on here, because cartoons were a big part of my life and still are. I still watch tons of cartoons because they're great. They're for everybody. I mean, there are ones that are geared towards kids and adults and preschoolers, but I think most of the stuff that I grew up with was generally considered general audience stuff. A lot of the jokes, there were a lot of jokes that flew over kids' heads, you know? There's all sorts of compilations on YouTube, for crying out loud, about all the adult jokes in this show or all the adult jokes in that show, because they knew that a lot of times people only had one TV. And if the kids were watching something, the adults were subsequently forced to watch that thing. It wasn't always the case in my house. We eventually got multiple TVs, but you know, for a lot of people that was the case. So they had to write these shows like that. Now that most homes have multiple TVs or multiple smartphones or whatever people are watching stuff on, eventually it'll be some sort of HoloVision, I'm sure, or VR or whatever. Now they don't try to be intelligent. They just dumb stuff down for kids, or they make stuff over the top vulgar for adults. It's killing the creativity. You know, I think the stigma definitely needs to go away, but people also need to be more creative in how they create animation for crossover general audiences. You know what I'm saying? They need to do it like they used to do it, and they're not doing it, which is why a lot of the television networks are dead, and why a lot of the streaming services aren't doing as well. A lot of the streaming services, HBO, they took an axe to so much animation, and some of that was warranted, some of it may not have been very good, but there were shows that people were expressing interest in actually liking, and HBO and subsequently Netflix just took an axe to it because the people in charge were like, oh, this animation stuff's for kids, and the kids aren't really interested in what's being put out. It's like, no, that's an old school, frankly, myth. It's a persistent myth. It's not the reality. You know, is the reboot of Animaniacs primarily a kids show? In some ways, but they understood that there's more adult humor in that, and I've got mixed feelings on that show. But there's no denying that animation is a flexible medium. It's not just supposed to be boxed in for children. That's not a healthy way of looking at that, or at video games, or at comic books, or any of these things. It's all entertainment for largely all ages. There's something for everybody. And that's great for the companies because they can make as much money as possible. They can cater to multiple different audiences at once. But somehow we got to get over this myth that animation is just for kids. I don't know how it's going to be. I don't know how people are going to do it. I don't know if it's going to be a case of the rise in anime or what. But we need to get rid of it in order for Hollywood to try to embrace it. Because I think that's something that could really reinvigorate Hollywood, would be a giant push for animation. If they see anime, and you know they do, instead of just trying to dub it and release it over here, why don't they start trying to make series like that? Because it's expensive? Why not? You've got entire Warner Brothers, Disney have entire animation division. Paramount, they've all got animation divisions. Why not put in the effort to tell more stories through animation? I'd love to see Western animated crime thrillers, Western animated crime dramas, or space operas, or all of these things that we see coming out of anime. I'd love to see Western companies do that, but they're not doing that. Why? I don't know, but they're not doing it. And I think it's primarily because of this persistent myth that animation is just for kids. As long as they keep ignoring that, and people need to keep just talking about it. People need to just keep saying, we need the West to start producing more of this the way Japan is. Japan is setting an example. We don't need to mimic their art style. We don't need to do everything exactly the same. We can find our own styles, but we need to be willing to do it and use the medium in that wide, broad stroke instead of just focusing on kids and adults and comedy. I love comedy as much as anybody else, but just because something is animated doesn't mean it has to be funny. All right? So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, and I will see you guys next time. This has been Super Koopa with another Koopa Talks. God bless. Have a good one. Peace.